Hi everybody, hope you're all doing well. Hope you've all got a few more gigs coming back in and the diary is starting to fill up again. I'm very lucky and cautiously optimistic that we are finally uh, on our way back to some sort of recognizable normality. Now, thinking of gigs and live performance, uh, brings me to the topic of today's video, and this is one of these kind of cozy chat type of episodes rather than dealing with specifics of playing. And it was inspired by a really interesting question from Robert the other week, who asked me about the whole idea of the drummer as a band leader. And obviously, as I'm sure you'll all know, having my own band has been a key part of what has defined my career as a player. And it's probably the thing that in the wider world of music, specifically in the world of jazz, it's probably the thing for which I'm best known. And that is, of course, having a like 15 or 16 piece big band and playing a certain kind of music in a certain kind of way. And there's a number of reasons that came about, and one of which obviously is that we had those kinds of records playing in our house when I was a child. You know, Buddy Rich's big band is the obvious one. There was Count Basie, there was Shorty Rogers, there was Woody Herman, there was some Ellington. So that sound of that music was something that was a very early influencer in my musical life, and it became the means by which I would develop my craft when I started playing with full-sized big bands when I was about 13 or 14 years old, most specifically and memorably the Midlands Youth Jazz Orchestra. Now, we're going back obviously more than 40 years. And back then there were all sorts of opportunities to play that kind of music. However, even in my late teens, I already had ideas about repertoire and things that I felt that all these big bands that there were around the Midlands, you could go and do a rehearsal 4 days a week with a different band, maybe sometimes more. So there was lots of opportunities to play, but none of them were quite ticking the boxes musically that I wanted them to. So at the, say, ludicrously young age of 19, I gathered together some music that I really wanted to play, and by a process of elimination found some good musicians who were up for it and wanted to play these things too. And I started doing occasional shows with a big band of my own in early 1983. I've still got the recordings, and actually some of it sounds pretty good. There's nothing to be ashamed of at all, and I'm going to, at some point, when I get my digitizing chops together, or get some new equipment, I'm going to dig out some of those old cassettes and put some of it on the unreleased recordings thread here on Patreon, because there's a lot of it, and it's if it only of kind of vague historical interest, it's certainly where the journey as the drummer, as band leader, began for me. So that apart, what have been the consequences, and this is where this gets important for everybody, what have been the consequences of me having my own project? Well, if I go right back to that first big band that I started at the end of 1982, as I said, I was able to get together a good team of players, and the problem started because there was a much smaller pool of musicians to choose from around the West Midlands, and back then, of course, a lot more work. It would become difficult if players became unavailable, if they got gigs or a summer season or a tour or something like that, that they weren't able to come and rehearse and do the occasional gigs that I would get together. So that in its own way was a motivator as far as me moving to London was concerned, which didn't happen till some, I guess, about 10 years after I first formed the original big band. But it was always at the back of my mind that this was something I was going to continue with, and primarily my long-term ambition was to create original music, which eventually we did and is there on the albums that we released in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So it was a part of my wanting to move to London, to have a bigger pool of musicians to call upon, which obviously is the case. You've got all those music colleges with all those great young players on the jazz courses and so much more, that when I got to London, it didn't take very long before I put together a new big band of my own. And this was the one that really connected and, as I said earlier in the video, became the thing for which I'm arguably best known in the wider music industry. If I'm in any way known at all, it's probably for doing that. So why is this important to you? Well, it is in a number of ways, because the music industry can be a somewhat challenging and unforgiving place at times. And when you're out, freelancing, working for other people, as a session player or as a band member, or with a touring musical, or if you're very lucky, a West End musical, or if you're a hired freelance player who does tours with artists, famous people from the 80s or the 90s and things like that. These are a lot of the things that a successful working musician will find themselves doing. And sometimes it just can be very, very comforting. And there's a lot talked about mental health at the moment, and it's an important issue. And our mental health as musicians can often be very, very much restored and benefited by having that special little project of our own that may be kind of lying fallow. It may be sitting at home on the back burner because you're busy doing other things, but having that to come back to, I find, can be really, really rewarding from a psychological point of view. Just having a brainwave, waking up in the middle of the night with an idea for some new music or new concept, and just jumping out of bed and going to write it down. I still do that even now. I haven't got anything as far as personal projects are concerned that I'm particularly bringing through, but there is, there are things in the back of my mind that haven't really kind of crystallized into some sort of recognizable form. So having your own project, you don't have to all go out and start big bands, and that's not something I would recommend. But it might be just something that you're recording yourself using like Logic, and just creating your own tracks. But having that thing to come back to that's yours and that you have control over is, as I say, in a whole variety of ways really rewarding. Another way in which it's rewarding is, and I was talking a moment ago about the myriad kind of different things you might find yourself doing as a freelance player. When you have your own project, you can be exactly the drummer that you want to be. You can be exactly the drummer you dreamed of becoming when you were, whatever, 4, 5, 6 years old and you first found out about all this. That's exactly what happened to me. Developing the big band from something that started, way back, playing like arrangements that I just bought in, to getting to a point where I was bringing in writers and getting them to make my ideas into actual pieces of music, whether they be original compositions or arrangements of pre-existing material. This all enabled me to be the drummer that I wanted to be, because the rest of the time, particularly when you're a young professional, you have to go whichever way the wind is blowing in the industry, and it's really important that you are the kind of drummer that the industry wants in order to make yourself employable. The early 1980s, when I was first taking my steps as a pro player, there was no pathway for a big band, mainstream jazz swing drummer, much less so than there is now, as far as working professionally is concerned. So I had to keep it on that back burner that I was talking about a few minutes ago. and kind of bide my time and be whatever kind of drummer the industry needed me to be in order for me to be employable. And that's exactly what I did, and that was just a pragmatic decision. If I was going to go to London and be successful and work across as broad a range of musical disciplines as possible, I had to do that. I couldn't just play one way. I couldn't play like big band swing through every type of gig where it would be completely stylistically inappropriate. And so that was that. But as I say, I always kept it there, simmering away quietly in the background until events turned a certain way. I'd become sufficiently established that I was able to call on top young players on the London scene and really bring that forward. And it's almost as though all that, jobbing, professional, freelance stuff that I was doing was almost like subsidizing the personal project that would come through, that would bear fruit in the mid 1990s when all that really started to happen. And so it's really important that it just has always given me a sense of purpose to have my own project. And here's another thing from a kind of hard-nosed business perspective. The other thing that having your own project will and can and might hopefully will do for you is it will enhance your profile in the drum industry. Now, as one or two of you know, I got very lucky back in the mid-2000s when I got almost simultaneously, I hooked up with a guy called Derek Bolton, who was one of the old school big band managers in the UK. He used to be Tony Bennett's manager. And he took me on and he said, if I did something more commercial than the stuff on our albums, he would put us in the theatres. So I thought, well, this is kind of a no-brainer. I'll do some shows featuring Buddy Richards' repertoire. And because that was deemed to be a bit more commercial, we were able to get out of the jazz clubs and into the provincial theatres around the country. Around about that time too, my great friend Ian Palmer asked me about, told me about a show that he had come up with as a kind of nod to Buddy Richards' legacy that he decided to call the World's Greatest Drummer Show. And in 2007, he asked me if I would be a part of that. And I did, and it was very successful, and it opened all kinds of doors for me into the drum industry, for which I'm grateful to this day. And then the following year, when he wanted to do another show, he asked me if I would bring my band up from London to Birmingham Town Hall and be the house band on whatever shows he chose to do in the future. And this is something that we've done very successfully ever since. And so because I had that great big band that I've been burnishing, that I've been developing over the years, that really put me in a very unique place in the drum industry. And there are other players out there who play in obviously I'm not the only big band drummer in the UK. There's loads and loads of guys who play that genre extremely compellingly well. There are guys out there who organise their own bands too, which is also of merit and highly commendable. But I got lucky at a bit of that right place, right time, which gave me a foothold in the drum industry that if I was just a freelance player, I wouldn't have got, unless I'd been fortunate enough to get a gig with some household name artist or band. So remember, your own band can do all these things for you. And if you've been hesitating about putting yourself out there and getting a project of your own together, now is the time to stop hesitating. The music industry is going to come roaring back in the months ahead, and so this is going to be a great time for small grassroots projects to really get established and really get a footholding, because these smaller types of shows are much more easily managed than massive tours and festivals in terms of the economics of what's involved. This is a great time to be coming forward with new and viable musical projects. So if you've been thinking about getting something together all of your own, don't hesitate. Do something about it today. Take that first step. Do it now and tell me when your first gig's coming around, and I'll do my very best to be there, unless you're on another continent. But even then, you never know. I might get around to see you. So if you're thinking about getting a project of your own together, there's probably never been a better time than this. So go for it, do it, good luck, and I look forward to hearing the results.